Hi, everyone. My name is Phil Hack. It's pronounced hack as in the type of code I write, which is why they let me be a program manager at Microsoft. And today I'm going to be talking about ASP.NET MVC at PDC, which is a mouthful of acronyms, but you know how we love our acronyms. So to give you a little background on myself, I actually started my career here in LA. I went to school out here, started off with classic ASP 3.0. How many people here loved ASP.NET 3.0? Yeah, there's a few like groans, but at the time it was nice. And then obviously ASP.NET came out, and I remember jumping for joy at that day that I could write object-oriented programming code for my websites. I've worked at places, consulting firms, and was where I started. Then I moved on to things like working at a Spanish language television station, built online games and tournament engines, and tried to start my own company, and worked at an open source search engine before finding my way to Microsoft. And now I'm based in Redmond, and the weather's not as bad as everyone says, so it's a great place. So today, my main objective here is to show you ASP.NET MVC, give you a sense of the flavor of what it's like to build an app. And what I hope that you get from it is that ASP.NET MVC puts you in full control, and it's awesome. So before I joined Microsoft, one of the questions I used to ask, and I used to see asked a lot, was why aren't there more websites out there built on Web 2.0 sites built on ASP.NET? A lot of the popular sites weren't built on ASP.NET. And some of you might be rolling your eyes right now thinking, well, Web 2.0 is this term that doesn't mean anything. There's a lot of it's just marketing hot air. And while in many cases that was true in terms of how it was being promoted, I think there were a few characteristics, concrete characteristics that I could point to that you might say were shared in common with these type of websites. So what I want to do right now is pick a website completely at random that I feel embodies some of these characteristics. And look at that, Stack Overflow. Jeff, isn't that your site? So StackOverflow.com here is a site that was put together by Jeff Atwood, who writes a blog called Coding Horror. That's Horror, in case you're wondering. And Joel Spolsky, who is the creator of Fogbugs. And it's a Q&A site for geeks. And so what I want to show here is, for example, one of the aspects of the site that you'll notice is there's this high level of interactivity and usability, use of AJAX. When I view the source, you notice there's this clean semantic markup, CSS-based design. What you're not seeing here is in hidden inputs that have huge strings of base64 encoded content. Not that there's anything wrong with that. The other thing you'll notice here is I'm using Zoom It, by the way, from sysinternals to do that zoom effect. So if it makes you nauseous, let me know, and I'll try to tone it down. What you see here, though, is that this URL is a nice, clean, human-readable, search engine-friendly URL. What you might have seen before with classic ASP.NET applications is something like questions.aspx, tag ID equals blah, blah, blah. And there's no way that you or a search engine looking at that can infer what's on that page, really. But with a URL like this, you can infer what's on the page, and so can a search engine, which improves your search results. Not only that, if I go in here and say, you know what, I really want to learn about XML, you just go in and you change it in the address bar, and the address bar becomes a secondary user interface. And it's not something that just geeks like us use. I've seen a lot of like my family members do this kind of thing in Flickr when they're looking at pictures tagged with puppies and they want to see kittens, things like that. And the other aspect of this is another commonality of these type of sites is the use of open protocols. So when I want to log in, I don't have to give Stack Overflow any information about my username or passwords preferences. I just use OpenID, which is a complete open protocol, and I log in. And I log in. So in a second, it will log in. The network's a little slow, so I had these extra tabs open just in case I needed to use them. But okay, now I'm logged in. You can see that I have a reputation score of 3066. Think of that as like Xbox achievement points for geeks. All right, so that's the kind of site I want to build with ASP.NET. And switching back, I want to show you one of the questions that's one of my favorite questions when I was browsing this site. There's a question here, is StackOverflow.com written on Ruby on Rails? And this was asked by a gentleman by the name of Obi Fernandez, who's really well known in the Rails community as an author and a developer. And the reason he asked this question is that Ruby on Rails is an alternative platform that embodies a lot of these characteristics, that's very Web 2.0 friendly. And so I'm very excited to say, well, no, the answer is ASP.NET MVC. So this is built using ASP.NET MVC. When Jeff told me that he was building this site with Joel, I called him up and said, you've got to build this with MVC. Please don't build it with Wasabi. Please don't build it with Wasabi. So if you're not familiar, Wasabi was a proprietary or a custom language that Joel built for good reason, but in any case. And so, as a matter of fact, they did build this with ASP.NET MVC, which is the primary focus of this talk. So let me ask the question, what is ASP.NET MVC? So first, it's a new web application project type. So if you're familiar with WAP versus websites, we only support web application projects at this time. And you'll see why as we get further. Also, this is an option. It's not a replacement for web forms. If you were here in the previous talk with the ASP.NET 4.0 roadmap, you can see that we're continuing investment in web forms. And everything we did with MVC builds on top of ASP.NET. So for example, we didn't go in and change any of the core bits or the underlying runtime in any way whatsoever. We just built layered ASP.NET on top of the existing extensibility layers. An analogy I like to use is the difference between manual and automatic transmission. It's not a perfect analogy, but it gives you a gist. MVC is a lot like manual transmission in that you have full control over your driving experience, but it also means you have a little more that you need to do. Whereas automatic transmission, things are done for you behind the scenes. So being that this is the PDC, I thought it might be interesting to talk a little bit about behind the scenes how it was developed. And some of these points were made in the previous talk. One thing we're really pushing here is transparency. So we had regular source code releases on Codeplex. And we didn't wait till the framework was really well built and the code looked really nice and we thought, okay, I'm proud to show this code. Now we decided to take it really early when we had code we were embarrassed about and said, you know what, let's just put it up there and see what happens. So by my count, and I don't think this is exactly accurate, we might even have more, but we've had 5 preview releases and 1 beta. So around 6 releases on Codeplex. And as part of that, we've received a huge amount of community feedback. We really feel like this project, this framework, is a community-driven effort. The other thing we do is develop this in an agile manner. So we don't allow check-ins unless there's code coverage. And our code coverage is at 94% and over 1,051 unit tests. So me and the development team, we're going to have a little party to celebrate 1,000 unit tests. Daily triage meetings and weekly design meetings. So we don't do a formal Scrum methodology. We do something I've heard called Scrum but. So we do Scrum but we don't do stand-up meetings, or we do Scrum but we don't do swim lanes. And our team is really small. So it's a small, agile team. So it's not a legion of people behind the scenes. And it makes it, I feel like it helps make us more responsive to your feedback. So what is MVC? Right now I'm talking about the pattern. So lest anyone gets confused, Microsoft did not invent MVC, the pattern. So Model View Controller is an old presentation pattern that came about in around 1974 as part of out of the Smalltalk community. There's a gentleman by the name of Trygve Ringskog who studied shipping lanes in Norway, and that's the genesis of this pattern. And it's an acronym for Model View Controller. So these are 3 different concerns that your application gets separated in. So one of the primary benefits and goals of the MVC pattern is separation of concerns. If I change the view, my model shouldn't have to know about that. So what does this look like in practice? Well, with ASP.NET-MVC, for every user interaction starts off as a request from the browser to the server. The controller class is responsible for handling user input, doing whatever it needs to do, and moving it along. So a request comes into the controller, and it will access your domain objects, your database, whatever it needs to, and formulate a presentation model. Now, typically, that presentation model might be an object specifically for your view, or in some people just string together a collection of objects in a dictionary and give that to the view. But whatever the case, you're getting objects from your domain and you're handing it off to your view. Your view, in turn, will transform the model that is given, transform that data into some appropriate form of output. And in our case, it's typically HTML, but sometimes it's JSON. All right, so for my next demo, what I want to do is show you what I call the File New demo. So I have Visual Studio here, and I go File New. So that's the name, hence the name of the demo. And what I want to show you here is, first of all, we have a template here, ASP.NET MVC Web Application. So this is what you get after you install the beta, the MSI for the beta. So like I said before, it's a web application project type. If I double-click that, you'll notice here that we have this dialog here. So usually you go straight to the project, but one of the goals we have with this project is to try to help usher people into good practice, what we think are good practices. And not everyone agrees, but so we have this, no, don't do it. But if you like writing unit tests, this dialog isn't just to remind you, this also helps you out. What it will do is, when it creates the web application project, it'll hook up the unit test project and reference that project. So that's something that usually takes a few steps. One of the other things I really like about this dialog is you'll notice here that Visual Studio Unit Test is not the only one in here. We have, in this case, I have xunit.net, which is an open source test framework. So what we did is we opened up this dialog to say and provided instructions for third-party test providers to hook in there and get their framework listed in there. So I went out and I downloaded the latest version of XUnit and installed it, and now it shows up in the dialog. Now, by default, only Visual Studio is in there, but if you go, most of the third-party providers, such as MBUnit, XUnit, NUnit, have templates available that will hook them up into this dialog. So I click OK. Visual Studio chugs along a little bit, thinks about it, and then it says, OK, I'm going to put your web application, and now I'm going to hook up the test project there. And if I hit Control F5 here to run the test project, you can see here, zoom in, we have 2 passing unit tests. So we didn't just add a test project and say, OK, you're on your own. We showed a demonstration how you might write a couple unit tests of action methods and included them in the default project template. So I won't go too much into the testing because we don't have the time for that right now. But so one of the interesting aspects of this is that this default project template, let me set this as the startup. This default project template has a lot more going on than empty web project. When I load this page, you can actually see what looks like a full application. As an aside, I actually saw that there was a website out there called greparty.com who took this template, built a site on it, deployed it exactly as is, with the same blue background, everything. At least change the background color in your CSS or something, really. So we have this concept of conventions over configuration. In many ways, if you follow our conventions, certain things will become easier and more intuitive. You don't have to follow our conventions, and you'll see later you can pretty much change anything you want. But by following our conventions, nice things happen. So our conventions all start in global.asax.cs. Oh, I did that. Good. With this routing call here. So in this call here, let me zoom in a little bit. Whoa, that was pretty. There we go. We have this, you see this URL pattern here. It says controller/action/ID. So all requests to MVC start with routing. Routing will look at the URL of the current request and figure out which controller should handle it. And so the URL will match this pattern, and we'll parse the URL into these variables. We'll get a controller out of it, we'll get an action out of it, and we'll get an ID out of it. Now, if some of these fields are not specified in the URL, we have the second line here with this anonymous object syntax that's used as a shorthand for just defining a dictionary. So just look at that and think of it as a dictionary. These are the default values for these things. So when we go back here and look at this request, you notice that there's nothing specified after this slash. But I can go here and do home/index, and we get the same page. So going back to that URL, what I'm parsing out here is home is the name of the controller we want to instantiate. Index is the name of the action method we want to invoke. So going back to the project template, you can see that we have a home controller. So by convention, we suffix the controller name with controller and look for a class by that name. Secondly, you can see that we have this method named index that adds some stuff to view data, returns this view, and index is the method that we invoke. So to see that, let me just put a breakpoint here and hit F5. And fill out the survey here. And you can see here that when this URL is calling this method here, I'm at this breakpoint. Woohoo! All right. The other thing is, you notice here that I returned this. Oh, let me stop. I return this view result. And I don't specify the name of the view. Because by convention, what we do is we look in the views directory, and we look for the folder of the controller name, and we look for a view with the same name as the action. So like that. Now, I can override this. I can say, return view of, foobar, and it will look for a view named foobar in that directory. But if you follow the conventions, then things are really predictable. So what are the goals of ASP.NET MVC? Well, the first goal is frictionless testability. If you write unit tests of your application and your logic, you want to be able to focus on your logic and not have to worry about the underlying framework too much. You want to be able to test your logic without having to start up a web server or start up a database. So we really wanted to make that easy with ASP.NET MVC. Tight control over markup. When you use our helpers, they're very thin veneers over the actual HTML. You have full control. With that control comes a lot of responsibility to actually render the markup. But there isn't markup that's being rendered on your behalf that you don't have control over or don't expect. User/SEO friendly URLs. So SEO stands for search engine optimization. So we wanted those hackable URLs that I showed you earlier. And we wanted to leverage the benefits of ASP.NET. So we didn't throw out the baby with the bathwater. ASP.NET is a really solid framework for building applications. And we were able to leverage things like membership providers and the web form views. So we really wanted to take advantage of that and build on top of it. And also we wanted to supply conventions and guidance. So the project template itself provides some conventions and guidance, the unit test dialog, and there's going to be more of that coming. So let's talk about separation of concerns. I mentioned this being one of the key principles and key benefits of using this pattern. So what that means is that each component has one responsibility. The model is responsible for being your domain model. Your view is responsible for rendering and transforming the model into output. If you change the view, you don't have to change your model. Now, a couple related principles is this SRP, or single responsibility principle. This talks about, for example, an object only has one reason to change. Ideally, like I mentioned again with the view, if I change that, my model shouldn't have any reason to change. And dry is another principle. Don't repeat yourself. Dry is another principle. Don't repeat yourself. So separation concerns makes it more easily testable. So when these concerns are separated, you can test components in isolation, and that's really valuable. And it also helps with concurrent development. So now I can hand my view off to the black-wearing designer guy, and he'll go off with that, and I can keep working on my controllers. It's also extensible. You can replace any component of the system, because we follow this approach of doing an interface or abstract base class based architecture, which means very few sealed methods, very few sealed classes with this framework. If you go to the framework design guidelines talk, the guidelines tell you don't make a method sealed unless you have virtual, unless you have a really good reason to. With this project, we decided to try flipping that on its head and saying don't make a method sealed unless you have a really good reason to. And we've seen that for this framework, it's worked out really well for us. Your results may vary. The other thing is we want to play well with others. And we'll talk a little more about that, but we don't prescribe active record. We don't prescribe that you use any particular data access strategy. You can use whatever you want. You can hook in and use your own dependency injection framework of choice. So whether it be Castle or Structure Map or Spring.net, we've supplied all these hooks so that you could put all these different components from other providers in there. And the test dialog is another example of that. All right. So I haven't told Jeff this, but I decided that for my demo, I wanted to build a competitor to Stack Overflow. And I'm going to call it Hack Overflow. So sorry, Jeff, but you're about to get hacked. All right, so what I have here is a default project. This is what you'd get right after file new, except I didn't choose to do any unit tests, and I need to show it to you. Thank you. That's pair programming at work, everyone. All right, so what I have here is Hack Overflow. This is a default site, and I went ahead of time and I created a little database. And so I'll drag this database into my app data folder. Whoops. And I'm going to create I had never used Entity Framework before, so I thought I'd give it a whirl for this demo. So I'm going to add a new item and do an Entity Framework model over this. So if you're not familiar with Entity Framework or ADO Entity Data Model, this is the simplest way I can describe it is it is an object relational mapper that maps your database tables to classes. I'm sure there are some ORM purists here who will beg to differ, but for the most part, that's the way you can think about it. It actually is intended to work with non-relational databases under the hood. You'll see some of that coming out of them, I assume. But let's create this Hack Overflow model, and we'll generate it from the database. And so now it's looking at my database, examining the tables, examining all the relationships between the tables, and, after I select tables. And it's going to build up this model. And so now I can access the data in my database using C# classes rather than writing stored procedures. Now, I used to be a big stored procedures guy, but these days I really like being able to write code that's against C# and have it go and do the data access for me. So we've got a lot of tables here, but for the most part for my demo, in order to make it fit within the time allowed, I didn't want to do a 3-hour demo. We're only going to edit one table of this system. So the first thing I want to do is let's get rid of the default index method. So the index method, again, is the first page of the site. And I want to show a list of questions. So brief note in case you didn't know. When you see that little tooltip bar, that little underline right there, the trick there is to hit Control Dot and hit Return there, and it'll add the using statement up there. So I don't know if you saw, but that got added. So Control Dot is the shortcut for that. I learned that recently, and I use it. I tell everyone every time I have a chance. All right. So here I just instantiate this entities object, and from there I can return to the view all the questions. Okay, one thing, before I go further, let me change the model up a bit. Oh, whoops, wrong. So you notice that question isn't named in a plural, and I really don't like that. So I want to go into the model, click on the question table, and scroll down here. And scroll down here. And so we can change the entity set to questions. I'll hit save and build to be safe. And now this doesn't build because I need to change this to questions. Great. So what I'm doing here is querying the database for all the questions in there, and I'm going to hand it off to the model. So the next step now is to, or hand it off to the view, sorry. Next step is to go to the view, and let's display these questions. So getting rid of all the markup that's already there. Oh, before I do that, so one thing I want to do is I don't have strongly typed access to the model yet, because the view page doesn't know anything about it. So I can use a strongly typed view page and specify the data type of the model. So in this case, I'm going to use IEnumerable of question, using my control dot trick there, and build that. And now when I do for each var question in viewData.model, which is the way I can access the strongly typed model, if I highlight model, you can see that it's an enumeration of questions. So now I have strongly typed access to that in my view. All right. And what I'm going to do here is just generate a list item of all the questions. So let's see, the question titles. And so you notice that I have tight control over my markup here. Too tight, if you ask me. It'd be nice if I could just generate that. So let's just take a quick look at that. Now, I promise you I'm not going to type out every single line of code in this demo. I know sometimes that can get aggravating, so I do have some snippets that will make this go a little bit faster. But I just want to start off with this very simple thing. So here we go. We have this view page that has a list of questions that are in my database. And so if you notice now that the workflow and the flow of the application is really simple, right? This URL calls a method queries the database, gives something to the view renders it. That's it. There's no events that you're dealing with. There's no pre-init, post-init, or anything like that. All right, so that's not that interesting. I'm really big into semantic markup, so let's clean this up. And actually, there's more information we want to show. So I'm going to take one of my snippets here and just pop that in there. So this code is effectively the same thing. It's just that I have a few divs in there that are printing out different information about the question. So now when I refresh this page, you can see that each of my questions has one vote, and each of them has 0 views. So I haven't implemented those features yet, and that's why. All right, so, okay, I can show you questions, but I need a way for you to be able to ask questions, right? So the next step is we need to link to another view that will allow you to ask a question. So what I'll do in the view here, let me just is I'm going to call we have these HTML helper methods. So anytime you do HTML dot, you get an IntelliSense. Now, before I continue, I know some of you are looking at these less than % equal nuggets, and you're thinking, oh my God, what is that? We're not using declarative controls in here, right? Declarative controls is something we are looking at, where they're actually a better term is declarative helpers. It's something we're considering for the next version of MVC. We really want to do a code first, declarative markup second type approach, so that we could write unit tests for everything that we do, and then we can always layer on configuration or declarative syntax on top of it. So that's why you're seeing this. Also, if you have concerns about spaghetti code, you have to realize that even in web forms now, you can write spaghetti code in your views if you want to. The point of the framework is that we try to help you and constrain you in such ways that you do things in the right bucket, model view controller, and you won't result in such spaghetti code. But in any case, continuing on. So I'm going to I'm going to link to an action that's named ask, and we're going to give it the actually that's ask. Yep, that's it. Sorry. We're going to link to an action that's named ask. Sorry, the first parameter is ask a question. It's the link title. And then we're going to give the name of the action. What's nice about this is that I can change my routing around in such a way that the URLs will look very different, but this method will always render the proper link to call that action method. So it's one of the benefits of not hard coding the URL right in this as just a normal action, anchor tag. Excuse me. All right, let's refresh this. I'll click on it, and you can see that the URL is /home/ask. So we're trying to call the ask method on the home controller, but we're told that that resource cannot be found. So we haven't implemented the method yet, so we get a 404 page. So let's go to home controller, and we'll implement an ask method. In this case, I just want to render out the view. It's a really simple action. I'm just going to render out a form that you can use to ask a question. So build that, hit refresh. And now we're being told that, well, okay, I found this method, but I didn't find a view for it. And it shows you all the places that it looked for a view. So one of the other aspects we're really trying hard to do, and of course this is where feedback helps, is make sure that our error messages are helpful. This tells me where it looked, so I know what to do next. I need to add an action. With beta, we added some tooling that makes adding a view for an action a lot easier. So if I hit Control M, as in Mary, Control V as in view, I get this little dialog. Now in this case, I'm not using a strongly typed view, so I can just click Add. And it's added a view, and it's set everything up for me using the master page that I have specified in there, the default master page. So things like master pages still work with the views here because we're leveraging ASP.NET. All right, so what am I going to do here? I want to render out a form. So I'm going to take some prepared HTML here and render out a form. So what you're seeing here is a using block, which renders out a form. At the very end of the using block, we call the end form tag. So the beginning calls the form tag, and the end calls the end form tag. This might seem like an abuse of the iDisposable pattern, but it actually, in talking to the language designers, it's actually one of the intentions of the iDisposable or the using pattern is to show a scope or create a scope such that something happens at the end of that scope. And so we're using it in that way, although we do have ways where you can just call it begin form and end form and not have to deal with this funky syntax. And so what we have in this form is a couple labels and a couple text boxes and a submit button. And we use this conventional pattern where we have question.title and question.body. So what I'm going to do is post this to an action method that has a parameter named question, and these values are going to populate those fields of that action. So what I need to do now is go back to my home controller and add that method. So in this case, I kind of want the method to be the same name. It's just a different HTTP method that I'm calling this method with, right? When I call it with the GET request, it shows the form. When I call it with the POST, it actually posts. So what I can do here, there's a lot going on here, but let me show you this. So I have this attribute up here, accept verbs. Excuse me. What that does is that says this method only responds to post requests. So this allows me to have two action methods with the same name, but they won't conflict with each other. If it's not a post request, this method will be called. This is the best match. If it is a post request, then this method will be called. And what I'm doing here is I'm creating up a new entities object, and then I new up a question, and I copy the properties over from the posted question. So if you notice here, I don't have a request.form that I have to grab values out. I actually have a full-fledged question object that I'm posting to, and now when I write my unit test for this method, I'm only dealing with a question that I'm passing to the action method. I'm not dealing with form values and mocking up HTTP context and all this stuff. And at the very end, we save the changes and we redirect to another action. So this is great if you practice the PRG pattern, post, redirect, get. When you post, rather than rendering a response in response to the post, you always do a redirect if you follow this pattern. And the point is so that people don't get that weird dialog when they hit refresh that says, oh, it looks like you're trying to submit form values. Did you really want to? You and I know what's going on, but a lot of people out there who use the sites have no idea what that means. So the PRG pattern is a good way to prevent that, and it's a usability thing. All right, so let's refresh this form. Oh, did I compile? All right. All right, so now I have this question. I ask the question, and it shows up in the list. Okay, so we're not quite to Web 2.0 yet, right? We're not even really, we're barely at 1.1. So we need to, for lack of a better word, we need to sex this up a little bit. So what I need to do is, let's throw some AJAX into the mix. So I'm going to grab this ask form here. And let's put it on the index page, just down here at the bottom. But let's change it up to use AJAX. So what I do here is instead of using the HTML property of ViewPage, which has a bunch of extension methods attached to it, I'm going to use the AJAX property, which has a separate set of methods. And in this case, I need to tell it a couple things. One, the name of the action I want to call. And two, a set of options. Whoops. I can't type today. All right, here we go. So let's see. First, I wanted to say, when it posts, I want to update some DOM element with the result. So let's just, for now, let's do something simple with message. So I'll create a div ID equals message. Great. And so let's start off with that for now. Great. Oh, and now I need to go back to the controller action. And here we're redirecting to, when we save the changes, we redirect. And I don't want to do that now if it's an AJAX request. So since I'm using the AJAX helper method, it sets some information in the form post that allows me to call this extension method is MVC AJAX request. And if it's an AJAX request, I'm just going to return a string for now. Oh, one other thing I need to do, sorry. So I do need to tell it to use the AJAX script. So let's go into the master page, and we go in the scripts directory. I'm going to grab Microsoft AJAX. Let's use the debug one just in case something goes wrong. Oh, sorry. Drag and drop. There we go. And Microsoft MVC AJAX. And you'll notice that there's a couple other scripts in there that are interesting. We have this jQuery, which is an open source, third-party script that we did not write, but we're including with the ASP.NET MVC, and we'll be including with Visual Studio in the next version. So for those of you who are jQuery fans, this ought to be a good thing, and we'll be hopefully including the IntelliSense for this in the next version of MVC. So I'm going to include that for now because I will use that later. So let's go back and refresh this page. And let's try this out. Okay, and you see there it updated. It worked. Okay, well, that wasn't quite what I had in mind in terms of sexifying the app up, so we need to do a little more. So this is where I'm going to bring in a little bit of jQuery love here and make a couple adjustments to this form. So the first thing I want to do is I want to change this form so that we actually update the list rather than just some generic message. So I can change the ID of this to the list name, or list ID, which is questions. Let's expand this out so it's easier to see what I'm doing. So we say update target ID is questions. Now it's going to notice that questions is an unordered list, and it's going to do the right thing. I also set an insertion mode to say, well, I want it to be before, after, or replace, so I'm going to say after in this case. And then, let's stop there. So what do excuse me. When I call this action method, I needed to return some markup. I needed to return the next list item after it adds a question. And so at this point, I could go into this home controller method and say, you know what, I want you to return, a list item and build it up again. But that would violate the dry principle. I'd be repeating myself. So what we want to do here is we want to create a new view user control and basically return a partial view when this method is called. Oh, whoops. In the next version, in our next release, we should have support using the view dialog for partial views, but we don't currently have that. So I'll have to go in here and use MVC view user control. And let's call it question partial. And what I want to do is basically take all this stuff that's in this list item here and move it into that partial. So we'll just call the render partial question partial, and I'm going to give it the current question. So I'm back on the index view. I'm in a for loop, iterating over each question, and for each question I give it to this view user control and I say, I want you to render it. So the view user control, we need to once again tell it what type it's being given. Build that. And now we can take that stuff and put it in here. I have a snippet. Oops. So if you're wondering, the only change I made was before I had question dot votes. And now that this is in its own view, I needed to use view data dot model dot votes. So now that I have this partial, let's just quickly make sure that the index page still renders correctly, that I didn't screw anything up there. Oh, yeah. So render partial doesn't return a string. It actually does the rendering. And so you have to remember to use the semicolon at the end there. If that's the worst mistake I have in this demo, I'll be very happy. All right, so it's still working. So in order to really make it look good, I need to change the style. And fortunately, I've been doing this entire site using semantic, clean markup, not using tables for layouts or anything like that. So let's drag in this. I have a bit of CSS that I can add in here and overwrite the existing CSS. And then I have a image I want to add. The Hack Overflow logo. And in order to really flash things up, I have a couple scripts that I want to add. So I went online and I got a plugin for jQuery called jQuery.color. It's open source. You can go online and get it. jQuery has a huge ecosystem of people writing plugins for it. So the fact that we're shipping it will hopefully add to that ecosystem. And in fact, we recently just contributed our IntelliSense files back to the jQuery team, and they've published it on their site. And FillScript is a little script I wrote that does some flashy animation. So go back to the site master page, and let's drag these last two scripts in. So jQuery color, oops, and FillScript. Okay, great. So if all goes well, you see, okay, now Jeff, you must be shaking in your boots because Hack Overflow is about to take over. So just by swapping out my CSS file, you can see that because I stayed with clean markup, I've got a site now that looks not too different from Stack Overflow. Let's take a quick comparison. All right, it's not quite there, but it's getting close. And, ooh, a little CSS snafu, but you notice my question is all the way over here on the right. But let's ask a question. Oh, sorry, one minor thing. So I mentioned before, I'm still returning this content here. So I need to change this method to say, you know what, I want you to return a partial view. The name of the view is question partial, and give it this new question that we just added. So compile, let's hit Control F5. Sorry, just. All right, let's try this one more time. All right. Oh, almost. Well, sorry. Wait. One last thing. All right. All right. So it updated the thing. So now let's use that jQuery stuff that I've been hyping up this whole time. So on complete here, or actually on success. If it fails, I don't want to give it all that flashiness. Let's call my method flashIt. Now flashIt is I believe in the fill script. Let's just double check. Oh, no. Okay, so I need to, there it is. Okay, we can get rid of this message. So I wrote this function called flashIt, and it's going to flash the question's ID element. So it's using a CSS selector here, which means whatever item matches the CSS selection, the same thing you would use in a CSS style sheet, it's going to call the flash method on that DOM element. So it's looking for something with the ID of questions with the list item tag, and it's using the pseudo class called last. So it'll be the last list item. So now I'm really ready to compete. And we get that nice flashy demo, flashy thing. Okay. All right, so why are we doing this? I mean, web forms are great. A lot of people using it. It's a mature, proven technology, scalable, extensible. I mean, we were able to build this on top of it. And it's familiar to WinForm developers. But it has its challenges. Abstractions aren't very abstract. It's difficult to test. And there's lack of control over markup. Sometimes it renders things you didn't expect it to or don't have control over. A lot of that, of course, is being fixed. If you were in the previous talk, we're going to give you control over client IDs in web forms. So right now I'd like to invite Jeff, who I'm competing against with Hack Overflow, to come up and talk about his experiences using ASP.NET MVC to build Stack Overflow. So Jeff, you want to come up? So Jeff has been, am I still on? Yeah, Jeff has been using ASP.NET MVC since Preview 3, I believe, to develop this site. And so he's got a lot of insight in how to build a successful MVC application.
So are we switched over to me now?
You're good.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for having me. And it's an honor to be here today because Phil and I have been friends sort of offline for a long time through blogs as well. And it just so happened that I felt that MVC was a good choice. It's not because I'm friends with Phil, although Phil's a great guy. I was increasingly dissatisfied with the web forms model. I don't work for Microsoft, so I can sort of say this with a straight face that I think web forms has a lot of problems that are really deep. And we early on in the project, the developers and I sort of huddled and said, how do we want to build this thing? And we all agreed that we wanted to get away from web forms, and MVC looked like a great model to start with. So let me show you the project here. Oh, the other reason I'm here, credibility. Like this site is actually live. Like here's our actual analytics. So if you're thinking of building a site with MVC and it's like, oh, that's crazy beta crap. It's not going to scale. It's not going to work. We're out there really doing it and getting, like 330, 350,000 page views per day. And just to emphasize that, this is what I call the Hanselman part of the demo, where I'm going to log into the live server, which makes Hanselman cry when I do that. He's very much anti anyone ever going in. This is in fact we just moved to a 2-server architecture. Up until Sunday night, we were 1 server with 4 gigs of memory and 8 CPUs. Now we have 2 servers. One is the web server and one is the database server, but they have the same specs, 4 gigabytes of memory, 8 CPUs. So you're actually seeing activity on the live Stack Overflow site. I mean, I could go into the profiler, and I actually do this, go into the profiler and look at the SQL and see what's fast and slow and how we can make it better and things like that. So I want to emphasize that MVC not only works from an architectural standpoint of clean code and testability, but also scales really well in the wild. So I'll go ahead and log out. Please don't hack my server. Yes. So that's what we have there. That's the credibility. So let me give you a little tour around the code. So at a high level, Phil talked about convention. And you'll notice if you look at Stack Overflow, if you look at our folder structure, it's going to look really similar to what Phil demoed. And if you had a developer coming up to speed, they could look at this and say, oh, I recognize all these folders, and I recognize all this code and what it's supposed to do and how it works. In addition to the ASP.NET MVC project, we also have a database project. Now, this is a team suite feature, the Team Database Edition. This lets us put the database under source control. So anytime there's changes to the schema or things like that, we can import them, get them under source control and all that good stuff. We use link to SQL, which is similar to the entity stuff that you demoed. But if I go into models here, we have a DBML file, which is just the link to SQL map to the SQL Server table so that we can reference them in code, kind of like what Phil was showing you. I don't think it's quite as fancy as entities, but it's been working really well for us on the project. We also have tests. I have to admit that our tests are probably not good. Our test percentage is probably 5%. It's really low. And it's okay. I know. It's wrong. It feels wrong not to have all the tests in the framework. But we do have the framework, and we're going to flesh that out over time, we hope. But we did build it in from step 1. I know. This is real-world development, folks. It ain't always pretty. It's a sausage factory, I'm telling you. Right? Yeah. Oh, I was going to bring up my blog. In case you know me from my blog, I was going to highlight that as well. The page I was going to show you is, we have this page, we throttle people. Like if they hit our site too much, we start to wonder if they're really people, and there might be scripts. So there's actually something we do at the ASP.NET framework level is we bring up this CAPTCHA control. And this is actually really cool. It's a reCAPTCHA. So you're actually helping OCR old books. So when people fill this out, and if you're bored, you can go to Stack Overflow and go to this page and, hey, I want to do some, you got nothing else to do. It's kind of a depressing lifestyle, but hey, I don't judge. You could go solve CAPTCHAs all day long. But normally you would only see this if you do things too fast or too slow or in a way that makes us think you're a little weird. So let me show you. That's how it works. So this CAPTCHA page is actually, I believe it's in shared. Yeah, here it is. So under shared, and that's under views. So as Phil demoed, if you reference this in your controller, say, hey, give me this view called CAPTCHA, it'll just look in the shared folder and try to presume that it's there and fill it out for you. So what you're seeing is the markup. And let me do Shift, Alt, Enter. Yeah, there we go. The fancy full screen keys. I don't have the zoom like Mr. Fancy over here. But in terms of markup, you're going to see a little jQuery. Nothing fancy. We're just setting the focus. But we really like jQuery. And our use of jQuery predates the Microsoft adoption of it, but we were obviously very excited about that. That's another thing. We had a huddle and said, what do we want to use for JavaScript? And one of our developers was like, man, I've fallen in love with jQuery. It's like the best thing ever. And I was like, okay, you're the expert. And we adopted it. And I have to say, I've been really pleased. And it's really encouraging to see Microsoft sort of get on board with more of the open source stuff. So a little bit of that. You're also seeing a master page, right? So we have a content block That's the sort of the header part, the main. So we have head and main. So this is also a master page aware site. So here's our other content block. And here you'll notice when it comes down to the CAPTCHA, I'm calling this render CAPTCHA method. So one of the things about ASP.NET MVC is it's not web forms, right? I mean, it's obvious, but there's a lot of really cool components for web forms that you can get that people have already built. And you might say, well, how do I use those in MVC? And when it came to CAPTCHA, we ran into that situation. There were pre-built web forms controls that could do the reCAPTCHA for us. We didn't want to reinvent the wheel, and we wanted to reuse that. So what we do, if I right-click here and view the code behind the scenes here, you'll notice I'm actually just instantiating it, saying, hey, give me one of these controls, setting some private and public keys that you get when you sign up on the reCAPTCHA site. You fill those values in, and then the theme, which is just a basic theme. And then I just return the render control method, which dumps out the HTML for the control. So really pretty simple. So if we go back here, you can see that just dumps out the HTML that renders the control. And then we have some errors and some basic markup. So the page is not very, very complicated, which is nice because it's doing one thing, which is tell me if this person is a human. So you don't want it to be this huge block of code to do that. So in terms of actually handling this, this is obviously a post back. So when we click submit here, there's something that happens. And that something is documented in the posts controller. Now here you can see we're setting up our routes. And you'll see that we have two routes here, CAPTCHA and CAPTCHA post. And let me scroll over so you can see them a little bit better. Right? So that's just telling, when you pass in those URLs that say /CAPTCHA and /CAPTCHA/post, they map to these methods.
So if I can interject, so now you could actually change it if you wanted to use the accept verbs attribute and have two methods the same,
we could.
if you wanted to.
Our use predates that, actually.
Yeah, well, I know.
We've been on the early beta, so some of the stuff we've had to do ourselves. But yeah, that's a good point about that. So I'm going to go down using incremental navigation. Should F3 a couple times here. There's the view that we built, and then the post. So here we're actually handling the data that comes back. And notice I call validate reCAPTCHA method, so let's F12 on that and see what's that doing. And it's really the same thing in reverse. I'm instantiating the control. I set my private and public, all that stuff. And then I'm just setting some values from the form that were submitted to the post. And then I actually return the validate value. And then based on that, here's the response right here, right? Oops, those aren't the correct words. So hopefully you would get it right. And then we just go back to the view at that point with the values. So I think that's most of what I wanted to show. I don't want to give you guys too much detail on this. But I do want to emphasize that we've been really pleased with our use of MVC from the very beginning. I mean, there's a few hurdles we ran into in terms of caching, basically. It's a little bit challenging with MVC. But in general, it's been a really positive experience. And
do you have anything? Well, can you describe what Stack Overflow is real briefly?
Oh, you guys want to know what the heck it is? Well,
yeah, I'm not sure that everyone knows who you are or what you do.
Okay, that's fair. So Stack Overflow is just a Q&A site, basically. One thing I couldn't really figure out in terms of my professional career was I had this blog that had gotten really popular, and I needed this project. I wanted to do something else. And I thought, what's the one thing I could do? I wish everybody could be as successful as I've been with the blogging thing, but not everybody is into that. So what I thought was, let's build a site that lets you take a small slice of your time and actually show off what you know. Because I work with so many brilliant developers that just had no profile on the web. And I just happen to, because I'm this loud, annoying guy typing stuff in this blog, so people know who I am. But that doesn't mean I'm actually that much better than anyone. So with Stack Overflow, you can actually go on, and actually you don't even have to log in. And it's like having a mini blog, kind of. You can ask programming-centric things, and other people will interact with it, vote it up, vote it down, respond to it, make it their favorite, and all that stuff. So it has elements of what I'm trying to show with this graph here is all these really sort of neat concepts we were trying to fold into Stack Overflow to build something that's not just another blog, it's not just another forum, it's something that's, it has elements of Dig, Reddit, all this stuff. So if we go back to the site here, and I'll go to my profile as a user, you can see like questions that I've asked. and how many people liked certain questions. Like a lot of people liked this question. This is actually a cool question, actually. Let me show you this. So I was doing some benchmarking for a blog post, and this is a legitimate question that I had in real life, right? It's like, when you're benchmarking things, how can you do that without writing the same benchmark code over and over? It's like, okay, loop, time it, right, all that stuff. And I got this really nice response from a number of people, but Matt Hamilton is the one I like the most, so I accepted his as the accepted answer. But he showed me this really cool Lambda method, which I kind of knew you could do it, but I couldn't really figure out how. And I knew my other programmers, my peers, would know, and sure enough, they did. And I voted it up, and a lot of people voted his answer up. It has 39 votes.
And that's what moves it right next to the question, so you can see the best answer immediately after the question.
That's right. Because I accepted this answer, it went up to the top. Okay. But if I hadn't accepted it, it would follow the voting sort order anyway. So basically, it's very vote-centric. So as people like the information, it floats to the top, hence the Stack Overflow element of it. At least that's the theory anyway. Yeah, it works really well. And you know, if you guys have little slices of time, I invite you to go to Stack Overflow. You do not have to create an account. This is sort of the revolutionary thing about Stack Overflow. It's like Wikipedia. You just go in and do stuff. And if you want to register, you can, but you can ask and answer all day long without logging in or any of that sort of pesky, annoying, you got to sign up, rigmarole.
Cool. Yep. Great. Thanks, Jeff.
Yep.
Can you stay up here?
Yeah.
All right, so we're going to have Q&A in a minute. I just want to finish up here, and Jeff's going to stay up here. So if you have questions about MVC or Stack Overflow, feel free. So what have we learned so far? So what we've learned is that, A, it's not a replacement for web forms. Some people find web forms really painful. Some people love web forms and will continue developing it. This is fundamental. It's not going away. It's going to be part of the system namespace, and it's made by the same team that makes web forms. We're all one ASP.NET team. Providers still work. This leverages ASP.NET. Like I said, we're in the system web namespace, and we even share features between the two different the teams that are working on web form features and the ones that are working on MVC features. Replace any part with your own. It's as simple or as complex as you want it to be. As you saw, Jeff is able to extend it in ways that were suited for his cause. And we try to play well with others. You can replace any part of the system with something open source or something that you purchased. It will all play nice together. So clean URL structures, I think I've talked enough about that. And so I'll be at the PDC Lounge Tuesday, which is tomorrow. I think Jeff will be there for a brief period of time. So if you have more questions after this Q&A session, come find me, ask me. I mean, if you have a question that you're a little embarrassed to ask, maybe the lounge. If you have a really great question, you should do it here and get some credit. So other related sessions, there's on this list here. We've got some talks on dynamic data. Stephen Walther has a talk on ASP.NET and jQuery, which will be interesting. Some AJAX features. The Visual Studio stuff is really interesting, a lot of the productivity and enhancements that are going in there. And some key sites that you should be aware of. ASP.NET/MVC is the site for MVC. That's the starting point. That's mainly our public-facing released stuff. If you're a person who really likes to get the bleeding edge, you can go to codeplex.com/ASP.NET and see what we're thinking about and what kind of stuff we're just throwing out there to get feedback on. And some notable blogs here on ASP.NET MVC. So that one's mine at the top. Since I gave this talk, I get to put mine first. Scott Gu is the second one, or Scott Guthrie. He's our corporate VP who writes a lot about the MVC. Scott Hanselman and Les Slipper is Alon Lipton, who's the lead developer for ASP.NET MVC. So he's one of those people that isn't quite as loud and annoying as Jeff, but he's got a really great blog and occasionally writes on MVC. So don't forget to fill out your evaluations and give us great scores. And this session will be available as a recording. And if you have any questions, please line up behind one of the microphones, and we'll take them right now. Thank you. All right, so I think I saw you first over there. Go ahead. I can't hear you. I think the mic needs to be... The mic is not on. Okay, well, he's walking up, so is the other mic working?
Hello? Yeah.
Yep.
Jeff, you said that you had some issues with caching in the MVC framework. I was wondering if you could expand on that.
Who is the mystery?
Oh, it's right there.
Thank you. That's a little disturbing to hear that disembodied voice. Now, is my mic on?
Yep.
Am I on? Okay, great. Okay, so restate the question. So just the challenges that we had with ASP.NET MVC?
With caching.
Oh, with caching. So one of the little pet peeves...
Excuse me, the gentleman in the red shirt, if you want to come up, I'll take your question next because you were already there. So just wait right here and I'll get you. So go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, we'll repeat the question. So one of the little pet peeves I had was that on a site like ours, which we're going to have a lot of traffic from day one, we had to be really careful about how we rendered things, particularly on the home page. And they did add methods in Preview 5, I guess, to cache like the result of a controller output, right?
Yep.
Am I saying this right?
An output cache attribute.
Right. There's an output cache attribute, which is really sweet. You can say, hey, just cache this whole thing. But the challenge for us, if you look at the Stack Overflow page, not everything should be cached the same way, right? Like certain elements of the page cannot be cached. Like the fact that when you're logged in, it says your name and your ID. And I actually played with that and actually deployed the site with that error in it. So people were actually getting other people's names on their... Yeah,
ouch.
So that was dumb, and I feel bad about that. But that's what I'm talking about, is basically the page needs to be decomposed into sub-elements, which have different caching rules. And you kind of have to roll your own at the moment to get that specific behavior.
Right. Well, you can use donut caching, or what we call the ASP substitution control, if you're using the web form view engine. But in terms of making it more MVC friendly, that's his feedback is definitely influencing some thinking we're doing about how do we improve the caching experience with MVC. All right. Thanks for the question. Let me let this gentleman ask.
Hi. Real quick, with your naming convention, you said we kind of glue things together between the controllers and the views. And then you did some magic stuff as far as defining the question and then pre-populating the entity question.
Uh-huh.
Are you doing that through reflection? I mean, usually one thing with ASP.NET that was always really cool over, let's say, like classic ASP was, they take those control markup languages and actually, those controls and actually build code. So you weren't doing any type of method invokes on the fly. I'm assuming that's how you guys are doing it, or are you doing something magical behind the scenes?
All right, so in this case, we are doing something, well, it's not all that magical. We have this interface, model binder, and we have a default implementation of it that does use reflection. So that will, if you map those form fields to the properties of the object, we'll use reflection, we'll set them. However, you can write custom model binders for specific objects. So if you have an object that you're using a lot in various forms, then you would write a custom model binder, and that doesn't have to use reflection. Right now, we're not doing any kind of code generation that you're talking about, although it's an interesting idea if there's some way we can hook that in to improve performance of that.
One follow-up. So have you guys considered potentially using the dynamic languages, maybe what Anders showed us in C#4, or potential, like Ruby on Rails, I don't have much experience with it, but it sounds like they take advantage of some dynamic aspects of languages that could help out in that sense.
So you're worried about reflection, and now you're talking about dynamic languages? Well, okay, so one of my other features that I own at ASP.NET is dynamic languages running on ASP.NET. So this is something new that I'm taking responsibility for. And so I recently published on coplex.com/ASP.NET an example using IronPython and ASP.NET. Web forms and IronPython on MVC. I also have an Iron Ruby prototype that John Lamb will be showing in his Iron Ruby talk, assuming it all still works, because it's very prototypey. But yeah, that's something that we're investigating in. I think I'm a big fan of dynamic languages, and I'd love to see us take that further on ASP.NET, because I think those languages are really on the incline. So yeah, you'll see more of that coming out. I don't have any timescales at this point. That's kind of part of my job as a PM, is that now I have to go back and make a plan and figure it out. So it's a good question. Thank you. So who is next? I think over there.
With the current beta, is there a go-live license with that? And then also, what kind of timeline is there for a final 1.0 release?
Okay. So with the beta, there is an explicit go-live license. There's no PSS support, so it's at your own risk still, but there's explicitly a license in there to go live. In the other previews, we never said you couldn't go live, so there was kind of this implicit go live, but we decided that with beta, we would make it very clear that it's fine. So the fact that Jeff went live, he's not in any kind of trouble. So And release schedule. So I know Scott Guthrie has written in his blog that we're planning to try to release at the end of the year. However, if you've all written software, you know how software projects go. That's what we're trying to do, but there's a chance that it'll be early next year. But right now, I mean, the beta is pretty solid, so and you can go live. You just won't get PSS support. So thanks for the question.
Thank you.
Okay, no one's over there, so.
Can you easily do progressive enhancement with this framework? So having kind of a base, Web 1.0 form that works with a basic HTTP post and GET, and then layer on AJAX over that?
Yeah, so you can use a regular form. So I showed in my demo the AJAX. The first form I showed was just a regular form that posts to a method. So a lot of cases when I'm building out sites, I start off with that, and later on I'll just add the AJAX by switching the method, changing the controller a little bit. And you saw in the demo it wasn't that hard. Now I moved the form to another view just because if it's AJAX, I can have them both together, and it makes a more interesting demo. But in general, yeah, it's a great platform for doing really tight iterative development. How long did it take for your first version of Stack Overflow to come out?
Gosh, I think we were pretty much up and running within, I would say, 2 months. I mean, in terms of having a version that's pretty close to the sort of mock-ups that we did.
Right. So the style of really tight iterations and incremental improvement is something that we really want to promote with this framework, and we're trying to do it ourselves as we develop the framework. So we have a lot of preview releases that we push out, and each one gets better than the last, hopefully. Thank you. So over there?
Yeah, could you use also this framework by decoupling the view from it and generating any kind of other output from it?
Yeah, so one thing I didn't show in this demo, but I showed in a previous demo, is that we have different kinds of action results. So the action result is what your action method returns. And so we have one, for example, called JSON. And if you give the JSON method, like you return JSON of some object, what we do is we serialize that object to JSON, JavaScript object notation, and we send it back to the response. So in that case, we've serialized your object into that format. But you could easily create results that render to alternative formats. Or you could use your view, for example, to render an alternative format if it's a text-based format. But that's definitely something that you could do, and I would generally do it in a custom action result. So we got a question over there?
Yeah, you mentioned more preview releases coming up. In the past, we've had issues with a lot of the changes in the preview releases breaking a lot of our previous code.
I've had that happen, yes.
Plenty of times. Moving forward, is there going to be more sweeping changes that will continue to do that?
Okay, so that's one of the risks of being really open really early, is that we're showing code at such a volatile state that happens, and it's unfortunate. At this point, though, we've given it the beta label, which means that for the most part, we're feature complete. We just have some minor DCRs, which we call design change requests, and bugs. So for the most part, there won't be a huge amount of churn. But where we find design flaws or problems, there will be some changes, but it won't be as sweeping as, for example, the change between Preview 2 and Preview 3, which was a huge change in the model. And that change came about because of feedback that we got from the community. So hopefully, at this point, we shouldn't have too many changes. Otherwise, Dimitri's our PUM who's sitting in the front here is going to have some hard talking to me. So in the middle there?
How would the view part scale to people who do not understand HTML, who just use the designer and try to click together their application?
Okay, so if you don't know HTML, MVC is going to be a tough framework to use right now. So it's really geared towards those who want tight control over their markup. In the next version, we will have declarative helpers so that you can do some stuff in the designer, and we have prototypes of that. But for the most part, it helps to know some HTML because unlike web forms where you drag a control into a page, and that control embodies all the logic for handling user input as well as rendering logic. Well, that doesn't quite work so well with the MVC model because when you drag something onto the view, it's only view logic. The logic to handle the interaction has to go in the controller. So for that kind of thing, you won't see anything that really helps you there in 1.0. But I would look at 2.0 for limited designer support.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Does ASP.NET MVC address bidirectional data binding?
Bidirectional data binding. No, because when you think about a website, right, by the time I send the model, what? Oh. Yes, ASP.NET MVC dynamic data. So we have another feature called dynamic data that's built for web forms. Scott Hunter here, who's the PM for dynamic data, is leading a team that's also developing dynamic data type features for MVC. And so that would be like the scaffolding, where you can just generate a grid, and then you can edit the grid and post, and it will all be MVC friendly. And designed with the MVC pattern in mind, not trying to cram something that doesn't belong in MVC into MVC. So you will see that, it just won't be in 1.0. All right, so we're running out of time here. I've got 1 minute, so I can accept one more question, and then if anyone else has questions, just come grab me afterwards. We have to let the next group set up. So last question?
Thank you, Phil. Do you see the MVC becoming an architectural alternative for the WCF in the future?
Architectural? No, I don't see it as being an alternative to WCF. I think when you're building, I see WCF as being a framework for building large-scale enterprise services. When you're building a website, it's generally content-driven, not services and data endpoint-driven. And what I mean by that is, like, I just have this page, I have some content, and I just need to make a quick call and get a little bit of JSON. I might as well just go ahead and call this action method that returns a little bit of JSON, and I don't necessarily have to go all the way to WCF. Now, if I'm building a service API that I want external callers calling, and I want e-tag support and all the layers of support that WCF adds to a service, then I'll want to use WCF. I mean, MVC is not really designed to be the WCF services layer. Thanks for the question, and I'm going to wrap up here, and I'll be in the lounge tomorrow, so at around 3, so come find me if you have questions, and I'll be off to the side here somewhere right now. Thanks very much.